The gentle hum of the airport terminal filled the air as John Edwards, an 88-year-old veteran, made his way through the bustling crowds. His weathered hands gripped a small, worn suitcase, and atop his head sat a faded military cap, its embroidered insignia a testament to a lifetime of service. John's steps were slow and deliberate, each one a reminder of the years that had passed since he last stood tall and proud in his uniform. The national tribute to World War II veterans had been a bittersweet experience for John. While it was heartening to see the country still remembered and honored the sacrifices made by his generation, it also served as a stark reminder of how few of his comrades remained. As he shuffled towards the gate, memories of faces long gone flickered through his mind, each one a cherished friend lost to time or the ravages of war. John's journey to the event had been a solitary one. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, and their children, scattered across the country with families of their own, couldn't accompany him. Yet, he had insisted on making the trip. "It's important," he had told his daughter over the phone, his voice firm despite its quaver. "I need to be there for the boys who can't be." As he approached the check-in counter, a young airline employee greeted him with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth as she noticed his veteran's cap. "May I see your ticket, please?" John fumbled in his pocket, producing a crumpled boarding pass. The employee's eyes widened slightly as she examined it. "Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice tinged with respect, "I see you've been upgraded to first class. It's a gesture from the airline to thank you for your service." Confusion flickered across John's face. "First class?" he repeated, his voice rough with age. "I don't understand. I bought an economy ticket." The employee's smile broadened. "Yes, sir. But we've upgraded you as a token of our appreciation for your military service. It's the least we can do to honor your sacrifice." John felt a lump form in his throat. It had been years since anyone had acknowledged his service in such a tangible way. "That's very kind," he managed to say, blinking rapidly to dispel the moisture gathering in his eyes. "But it's not necessary. I didn't serve for recognition or rewards." The young woman reached across the counter, gently patting his hand. "We know, Mr. Edwards. That's precisely why we want to do this for you. Please, enjoy the comfort. You've more than earned it." With a nod of thanks, John accepted the new boarding pass and made his way towards security. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for the unexpected kindness, but also a touch of unease. First class was a world he had never been part of, a realm of luxury that seemed at odds with the simple life he had led. The security process was an ordeal for John. Removing his shoes, belt, and jacket was a laborious process, his arthritic fingers struggling with buckles and laces. But the TSA agents, noticing his veteran's cap, showed remarkable patience. One young man even knelt down to help John retie his shoelaces after he passed through the scanner. "My grandpa was in the Navy," the agent said as he worked. "Served in the Pacific. He always said the real heroes were the guys on the ground." John chuckled softly. "We all did our part," he replied. "On land, sea, or in the air. We were just kids doing what needed to be done." As he made his way to the gate, John's mind wandered back to those days. He had been barely 18 when he enlisted, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never ventured further than the county line. The war had taken him across the world, shown him horrors he could never have imagined, and forged friendships that would last a lifetime. The boarding process began, and John found himself ushered towards the front of the line. "First-class passengers and those needing extra assistance, please board now," the gate agent announced. John hesitated, and used to being at the front of any line. A gentle hand on his elbow guided him forward. "Right this way, sir," a flight attendant said, her voice kind. "Let's get you settled in." As John stepped onto the plane, the difference between first class and his usual economy seats was immediately apparent. The cabin was spacious, with wide, plush seats that looked more comfortable than his recliner at home. The flight attendant led him to his seat, 2A, a window spot with ample legroom. "Can I help you with your bag, sir?" she asked, gesturing to his small suitcase. John shook his head. "No, thank you. I can manage. He didn't mention that the bag contained precious cargo, his dress uniform, carefully folded, and a small album of photos from his war days. These were treasures he preferred to keep close. As he settled into the soft leather seat, John couldn't help but feel out of place. The other passengers filing into first class were dressed in sharp business suits or designer clothes, their perfumes and colognes mingling in the air. John, in his simple slacks and button-up shirt, topped with his veteran's cap, felt like a relic from another time. A well-dressed man in the seat across the aisle gave John a curious look, his eyes lingering on the cap. For a moment, John thought he might say something, but the man simply nodded in acknowledgement before turning his attention to his smartphone. John gazed out the window, watching the ground crew scurry about their duties. He remembered the airfields of Europe, the roar of engines and the acrid smell of fuel. How different it all seemed now, so orderly and civilized. Yet, as he observed the choreographed dance of modern air travel, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This, too, was part of the world he and his comrades had fought to preserve. As the last of the first-class passengers boarded, John closed his eyes, allowing the gentle hum of conversations to wash over him. He was tired, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came not just from travel, but from the weight of years and memories. The tribute ceremony had stirred up so much: joy at seeing old friends, sorrow for those who were no longer with them, and a bittersweet pride in the legacy they had all helped to create. Little did John know that this flight, intended to be a simple journey home, would become an unexpected battlefield of its own. Not one fought with weapons, but with words, actions, and the power of human understanding. As the plane prepared for takeoff, carrying its diverse cargo of souls into the sky, the stage was set for an encounter that would challenge perceptions, evoke long-buried emotions, and ultimately, reaffirm the enduring power of compassion and respect. As the last passengers trickled into the first-class cabin, John Edwards shifted in a seat, trying to find a comfortable position for his aging bones. The leather upholstery, though plush, felt foreign against his worn clothing. He removed his veteran's cap, running a hand through his thinning white hair, and placed it carefully on his lap. The cap was more than just a piece of headwear. It was a symbol of his identity, a tangible link to the young man he once was and the brothers in arms he'd never forget. The hustle and bustle of boarding continued around him, a symphony of rustling clothes, clinking luggage, and muted conversations. John closed his eyes, allowing the familiar sounds of pre-flight preparations to wash over him. It was almost soothing, a reminder that some things remained constant in an ever-changing world. His moment of peace was abruptly shattered by the click-clack of high heels approaching his row. John opened his eyes to see a woman, impeccably dressed in a tailored business suit, her hair coiffed to perfection, standing in the aisle. She was looking at her phone, manicured fingers tapping furiously at the screen. Without glancing up, she began to maneuver into the row, clearly intending to take the aisle seat next to John. As she did so, her expensive leather handbag brushed against John's arm, causing him to flinch slightly at the unexpected contact. It was then that the woman finally looked up, her eyes widening as they fell upon John. Her gaze traveled from his weathered face to his simple clothes, then to the veteran's cap in his lap. A frown creased her perfectly made-up features. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "I believe you might be in the wrong section. This is first class." John blinked, taken aback by her abrupt manner. "No, ma'am," he replied politely, reaching for his boarding pass. "I'm in the correct seat. 2A right here." The woman's frown deepened. She made no move to take her seat, instead shifting her weight and crossing her arms. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "This section is for people who paid for it. Economy class is further back." John felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He was acutely aware of the other passengers around them, some now openly watching the exchange. "I understand your confusion," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "But the airline upgraded me. I have a valid ticket for this seat." The woman's expression hardened. "Upgraded?" she scoffed. "I find that hard to believe. I'm a frequent flyer, and They don't just hand out first-class seats to. She paused, her eyes once again taking in John's appearance. To just anyone. The implication in her words hung heavy in the air. John felt a familiar ache in his chest, one he hadn't experienced in years. It was the pain of being judged, of being found wanting based on nothing more than appearance. He had faced similar prejudice as a young soldier returning from war, when some people couldn't see past his uniform to the man beneath. Now, decades later, he found himself again being measured and dismissed by someone who knew nothing about him. "Ma'am," John began, his voice steady despite the emotion building within him, "I assure you, I have every right to be here. The airline offered me this seat as a gesture of appreciation for my military service." He held out his boarding pass, the first-class seat assignment clearly visible. The woman barely glanced at the ticket. Instead, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Military service?" she said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "That hardly seems a reason to displace paying customers. I'm sure you understand that this is highly irregular." By now, their exchange had caught the attention of nearly everyone in the first-class cabin. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the air, though it wasn't clear whether they were directed at John or the woman. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure whether to intervene. One man, seated across the aisle, leaned forward. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes darting between John and the woman. Before John could respond, the woman turned to the man, her voice filled with indignation. "No, it's not all right. This gentleman," she said, infusing the word with doubt, "claims he's been given a first-class seat because of some supposed military service. I've never heard of such a thing. He's clearly trying to get something for free." John felt his face grow hot with a mixture of shame and anger. He had faced enemy fire, watched friends fall in battle, and endured the long, painful process of rebuilding a world shattered by war. Yet here he sat, being accused of duplicity by someone who couldn't begin to understand the sacrifices he and his comrades had made. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, "I fought for this country. I've seen things you couldn't imagine. I'm not trying to get anything for free. I'm simply accepting a kindness offered to me, something I've rarely asked for in all my years." The woman's expression flickered for a moment, a hint of uncertainty crossing her face. But it was quickly replaced by renewed indignation. "Well," she huffed, "I still think this is highly inappropriate. I'm going to speak to the flight attendant about this." As if on cue, a flight attendant appeared at the end of their row. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with a warm smile that faltered slightly as she took in the tense scene before her. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice professional but tinged with concern. The woman immediately launched into her grievance. "Yes, there most certainly is," she said, gesturing towards John. "This man claims he's been given a first-class seat due to military service. I've never heard of such a policy, and I fly frequently. I think there's been a mistake, and I'd like it rectified immediately." The flight attendant listened patiently, her eyes moving from the woman to John, who sat silently, his hands clasped tightly around his veteran's cap. When the woman finished speaking, the attendant turned to John with a gentle smile. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" John wordlessly handed over his ticket, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. The flight attendant examined it carefully, then looked back at John, her smile widening. "Everything is in order, sir," she said warmly. "You're in the correct seat. It's our airline's policy to upgrade veterans when possible, as a small token of our gratitude for their service." She turned to the woman, her tone remaining professional, but with a hint of firmness. "Ma'am, Mr. Edwards is correctly assigned to this seat. I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat, so we can prepare for takeoff." The woman's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth as if to argue further, then snapped it shut. With a huff, she roughly stored her bag in the overhead compartment and all but fell into her seat, pointedly avoiding looking at John. As the flight attendant moved away, a heavy silence fell over their row. John could feel the tension radiating from the woman beside him, could sense the stares of the other passengers. He wished he could disappear, sink into the plush seat, and become invisible. This was supposed to be a simple journey home, a quiet end to an emotional trip. Instead, it had become a public spectacle, a humiliation he hadn't experienced in decades. Yet, as the initial shock of the confrontation began to fade, John felt something else stirring within him. It wasn't anger, though he had every right to be angry. It wasn't even resentment towards the woman who had so quickly judged and dismissed him. Instead, he felt a profound sadness. Sadness for a world where appearances still mattered more than character, where sacrifices could be so easily forgotten or discounted. As the plane began to taxi, John gazed out the window, watching the airport terminal slide away. He thought about the men he had served with, the bonds forged in the crucible of war. He thought about the world they had fought to create, a world of freedom and opportunity for all. And he wondered, not for the first time, if they had truly succeeded. The incident had shaken him, yes, but it had also awakened something in John. A determination, perhaps, to make this uncomfortable situation into something meaningful. As the plane lifted off the ground, carrying them into the sky, John began to formulate a plan. He would not let this encounter end in bitterness and misunderstanding. Somehow, he would find a way to bridge the gulf between himself and the woman beside him, to turn this moment of conflict into an opportunity for understanding. With that resolve firmly in mind, John settled back into his seat, closed his eyes, and began to compose the words he would soon put to paper. The journey, he realized, was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft ding. The cabin fell into a hushed silence, punctuated only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of passengers settling in for the flight. John Edwards sat motionless, his weathered hands resting on the veteran's cap in his lap, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The woman beside him maintained a rigid posture, her eyes fixed straight ahead, pointedly avoiding any contact with John. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible barrier that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment of silence. A young flight attendant, different from the one who had intervened earlier, made her way down the aisle with a drink cart. As she reached their row, she offered a warm smile to both John and the woman. "Would either of you care for a drink?" she asked, her voice gentle and professional. John cleared his throat. "Just water, please," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. The woman beside him requested a glass of white wine, her tone clipped and businesslike. As the flight attendant prepared their drinks, she glanced at John's cap. Her eyes softened with recognition. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said quietly, handing him his water. John nodded in acknowledgement, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, miss. It was a long time ago." The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the flight attendant's words clearly adding to her discomfort. She accepted her wine without a word, immediately taking a large sip. As the flight attendant moved on, John found himself reflecting on the situation. The confrontation at the beginning of the flight had stung, bringing back memories of times when he and his fellow veterans had faced misunderstanding and even hostility upon their return from war. But now, as he sat in the quiet of the cabin, he felt a different emotion stirring within him. Not anger or resentment, but a deep sense of sadness and a desire to bridge the gap that had formed between him and his seat companion. With a soft sigh, John reached for the in-flight magazine in the seat pocket before him. But instead of flipping through its glossy pages, he turned to the blank crossword puzzle at the back. Borrowing a pen from his shirt pocket, he began to write. The words came slowly at first, each one carefully considered. This wasn't a letter of complaint or accusation. Instead, John found himself pouring out his heart, sharing glimpses of his experiences and the lessons life had taught him over his long years. He wrote about enlisting as a young man, barely out of high school, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to protect the freedoms he held dear. He described the camaraderie he had found among his fellow soldiers, men from all walks of life united by a common purpose. Without dwelling on the horrors of war, he touched upon the sacrifices made by so many, not just those who had given their lives, but also those who had returned forever changed. As his pen moved across the page, John reflected on the world he and his comrades had fought to preserve, a world of opportunity, equality, and mutual respect. He wrote about the importance of looking beyond appearances, of reserving judgment, and of treating each person with dignity, regardless of their station in life. Towards the end of his impromptu letter, John's writing took on a more personal tone. He shared his feelings about the incident at the start of the flight, not with anger or accusation, but with honesty and vulnerability. He expressed his hurt at being judged so quickly, but also his understanding that everyone, himself included, was capable of making hasty judgments. Finally, John concluded his letter with a message of hope and reconciliation. He wrote of his belief that it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to bridge the divides that separate us. He expressed his wish that this uncomfortable encounter might serve as a reminder of the power of kindness and the importance of seeing the humanity in each person we meet. As he finished writing, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. Whether or not the woman would read his words, whether or not they would have any impact, the act of putting his thoughts to paper had been cathartic. It had allowed him to transform a moment of conflict into an opportunity for reflection and, hopefully, understanding. Folding the magazine page carefully, John caught the eye of a passing flight attendant, the same young woman who had helped him earlier. With a gentle smile, he handed her the folded paper. "Would you mind giving this to the lady next to me when I go to the restroom?" he asked quietly. "It's just a note to clear the air." The flight attendant nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to." With that, John excused himself and made his way to the lavatory, his movements slow but deliberate. As he walked, he felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Whatever came next, he had done what he could to extend an olive branch, to turn a moment of misunderstanding into an opportunity for growth. As John returned to his seat, he noticed the woman holding the folded paper, her expression unreadable. He settled back into his seat without a word, closing his eyes as if to nap. But inwardly, he remained alert, wondering how his words would be received, and hoping that they might, in some small way, make a difference. The gentle hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin as John Edwards pretended to doze in his first-class seat. In reality, his senses were acutely aware of every movement, every sound from the woman seated beside him. He had taken a considerable risk in writing that note, laying bare his thoughts and feelings. Now, all he could do was wait. From behind his closed eyelids, John heard the soft rustle of paper, the sound of his note being unfolded. He resisted the urge to open his eyes, to gauge the woman's reaction. Instead, he focused on keeping his breathing steady, feigning sleep while his heart raced with anticipation. Beside him, the woman began to read. At first, her posture remained rigid, her movements tense as she held the paper. But as she progressed through John's heartfelt words, a change came over her. Her shoulders, which had been set in a defensive posture since the beginning of the flight, gradually relaxed. The sound of her breathing shifted, becoming less shallow, more measured. John heard a sharp intake of breath, a small gasp quickly stifled. Then, the unmistakable sound of a sniffle. He fought the instinct to open his eyes, to offer comfort. This was her moment, he knew, a private reckoning with the words he had written and the man she had so quickly judged. The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours to John. He heard the paper being carefully refolded, then the soft thud as the woman's head fell back against the headrest. A long, shaky sigh escaped her lips, a sound filled with a complex mix of emotions that John couldn't quite decipher. Finally, unable to maintain the pretense any longer, John slowly opened his eyes. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of the woman from the corner of his eye. Her face was turned away from him, looking out the window, but he could see her reflection in the plexiglass. Tears glistened on her cheeks, her carefully applied makeup now slightly smudged. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had transformed from one of tension to one of shared vulnerability. John waited patiently, allowing the woman the time she needed to collect her thoughts. At last, she turned to face him, Her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, met his. The haughtiness that had marked her features at the beginning of the flight was gone, replaced by a look of profound regret and something else, a dawning recognition. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. Your words." She paused, swallowing hard. "They've touched me deeply. I behaved abominably, and I'm truly sorry." John nodded, a small, gentle smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply. "I appreciate that." The woman took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say next. "Your letter. It brought back so many memories. My father." Her voice cracked slightly. "My father was a veteran too. He served in Vietnam." John's eyebrows raised slightly, surprise and understanding dawning in his eyes. He never talked much about his experiences, the woman continued, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "But I remember as a child, seeing him stare off into space sometimes, lost in memories I couldn't understand. He struggled after the war. With nightmares, with fitting back into civilian life." She paused, her fingers absently tracing the edges of John's folded note. "I think, in some ways, I've been angry at the war for taking parts of my father away. And when I saw you, it brought all those complicated feelings back. But that's no excuse for how I treated you. I judged you without knowing you, without honoring the sacrifices you and so many others have made." John reached out, gently patting the woman's hand. "War leaves scars on everyone it touches," he said softly. "Not just the soldiers, but their families too. I'm sorry for what you and your father went through." The woman nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you. But I'm the one who should be apologizing. My behavior, it dishonored my father's memory. He would have been ashamed of how I acted." "Perhaps," John said, his voice kind, "but I think he would be proud of you now. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, to open ourselves up to new understanding." A wan smile crossed the woman's face. "You're very generous, Mr. Edwards. More than I deserve." John shook his head. "It's not about deserving. It's about choosing to see the best in each other, to extend kindness even when it's difficult. That's what I fought for all those years ago, not just for freedom, but for the chance to build a world where people can connect, can grow, can learn from one another." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and newfound respect. "Your letter mentioned that you believe it's never too late to learn and grow. I think I understand that now, thanks to you." As the plane began its descent, John and the woman continued to talk. She shared stories of her father, the good times, the difficult times, the legacy he had left behind. John listened attentively, occasionally sharing his own experiences, finding common ground in their shared connection to military service. By the time the aircraft touched down, a transformation had taken place. The tension that had marked the beginning of their journey had dissolved, replaced by a tentative but genuine connection. As they prepared to disembark, the woman turned to John one last time. "Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice filled with sincerity, "thank you. Not just for your service all those years ago, but for your kindness today. You've taught me a valuable lesson, one I won't forget." John smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Thank you for being open to it. Remember, every day is a new chance to make a difference, to bridge the divides between us. That's the real victory, not what happens on battlefields, but what we do in our everyday lives to make the world a little bit better." As they parted ways in the terminal, John watched the woman walk away, her posture noticeably different, head held high, but with a new humility in her step. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The trip, which had begun with a tribute to the past, had become something more, a bridge to the future, a small but significant step toward the kind of understanding and compassion he had always hoped his service would help create. With a contented sigh, John adjusted his veteran's cap and made his way toward the exit, his heart light despite the weight of his years. He had come on this journey to honor the past, but in doing so, he had helped shape a small piece of the future. And in that, he found a renewed sense of purpose and hope. As he stepped out into the bright sunlight, John realized that his service to his country and to the ideals he held dear had not ended with his military career. It continued in these small moments, these opportunities to foster understanding and kindness. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to serve in this way. One conversation, one act of forgiveness, one bridge built at a time. The doors of the airport slid closed behind him, marking the end of this chapter, but the beginning of countless possibilities. John Edwards, veteran and unexpected teacher, walked on, carrying with him the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought and a victory well earned, not on the fields of war, but in the equally important realm of the human heart.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.